Please. I have nowhere else to stay. I will be grateful for even a corner of your stable, she whispered, her voice trembling, fragile as the snowflakes that clung to her damp skirts. The courtyard stretched before her like a frozen tableau, the stones slick with ice and powdered with snow, reflecting the dim morning light that filtered weakly through the gray winter sky. Each footstep she took crunched sharply, a brittle accompaniment to the pounding of her heart, which seemed to echo against the silent walls of the grand manor. Her gloves were soaked, her hair clinging in damp strands to her face, yet she held herself, with a quiet dignity born of necessity rather than pride. The wind tugged at her shawl, and she pressed it closer, shivering against the bitter cold. Above her the tall, imposing doors of the manor remained steadfastly closed, their polished oak glinting faintly in the muted light. From the upper windows, she could see shadows stir, curious eyes peering out, glimpses of silken gowns and servants' uniforms, their whispers lost to the winter wind but felt as keenly as the sting of frost on her cheeks. And then, finally, a presence, the Duke, standing atop the steps with a posture as rigid as the stone pillars flanking him. His gaze fell upon her, sharp and unyielding, like a hawk assessing prey, yet beneath it lay an inscrutable depth that she could not quite read. "Madam." His voice was low, measured, resonant, echoing slightly against the cold stone walls. "Propriety must be preserved. I cannot allow it." The words landed like a heavy door slammed upon her aspirations, closing off hope and warmth in equal measure. She felt the sharp sting of humiliation rise in her chest, a blush coloring her pale skin even as the cold sought to wash it away. She bowed her head instinctively, not in submission, but in acknowledgment of the social force pressing down upon her. Around her, the servants murmured in restrained curiosity, their eyes wide, mouths pursed. A few glanced away, pretending to attend to trivial duties, yet she felt their judgment weigh like the bitter wind that whipped around her. She wanted to speak, to offer some explanation of her circumstances, some plea that might soften his rigid demeanor. Yet the words caught in her throat, tangling with the fear of rejection and the strange mixture of awe and resentment she felt toward the imposing figure before her. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edges of her skirts, drawing herself into a semblance of control, even as the cold gnawed at her fingers and toes. The Duke remained still, his figure carved in discipline and authority, yet she thought she glimpsed, for the briefest instant, a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, or an unwilling admiration hidden beneath the stoicism. The snow continued to fall in soft, silent waves, dusting her hair and shoulders, turning the courtyard into a muted, monochrome stage upon which she stood as both actress and audience. She drew a steadying breath, the cold air biting at her lungs, and turned her gaze toward the stables that flanked the manor. The faint scent of hay, mingled with the earthy musk of horses, reached her nose even through the icy air. Perhaps there, among the low beams and the warmth of animal bodies, she could find a measure of shelter, a place where her dignity would not be constantly tested by eyes so quick to judge. As she stepped carefully toward the stables, her boots crunching against frozen gravel, she felt the weight of solitude press down more heavily. She was a stranger in this grand estate, a mail-order bride brought here by circumstance and hope alike, and yet she carried herself as though she belonged, even when the world insisted otherwise. Inside the stables, the air was warmer, tinged with the familiar scent of straw and the sweet undertones of oats. The horses raised their heads, nostrils flaring, as if curious about this newcomer who approached with tentative confidence. One chestnut mare stepped closer, nuzzling her gloved hand with a gentle intelligence, offering a quiet companionship that no human presence had yet extended. She set to work, brushing the horses' coats, arranging hay, and performing each task with care and precision. The rhythm of her movements, deliberate and soothing, calmed the pounding of her heart and allowed her a small measure of control in an otherwise uncertain day. And yet, even in this quiet refuge, she could not fully escape the awareness of the Duke's presence beyond the walls. Occasionally, she caught a glimpse of him through the frosted windows of the manor, tall and immovable, watching. She did not know whether his gaze was approving, assessing, or merely curious, but each sighting sent a tremor through her chest, a mixture of fear and something altogether stranger, anticipation. Time passed with a slow cadence of falling snow, each hour stretching languidly across the manor grounds. The sky darkened, softening to a gentle gray, and the air grew heavier with the promise of night. Yet within the stables, a quiet resilience blossomed. She hummed softly to herself, a melody learned in a home long left behind, and the horses seemed to lean into the comfort it offered. The rhythm of brush against coat, of hay shifted and piled, became almost meditative, a counterpoint to the storm of uncertainty beyond the wooden walls. Through the windows, the Duke remained an enigmatic sentinel, observing with a stillness that suggested more than mere curiosity. He was a man ruled by discipline and duty, yet in the subtle way his gaze lingered, she sensed the stirrings of an internal conflict, a questioning of the rigid boundaries he had set for himself and for those around him. Each brushstroke she made seemed to draw his attention further, not in triumph, but in silent recognition of her courage, her fortitude, her quiet defiance of the humiliation imposed upon her. By the late afternoon, the wind had begun to wail more insistently, carrying snow in sharp, stinging gusts. She paused, stepping back to survey the stable, her cheeks flushed from exertion and cold alike. In that moment, a subtle shift occurred, a sense that the day, which had begun with rejection and cold authority, was bending toward something unexpected. The Duke had not yet spoken again, yet the way his shadow fell across the courtyard from the window suggested a man unsettled, curious, and perhaps, in some unspoken manner, moved. She straightened, adjusting her wet skirts and gloved hands, and allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. It was not the smile of triumph, nor of victory over circumstance, but of quiet endurance, of hope tempered by humility. And as she turned her gaze once more toward the manor, her heart prickled with the knowledge that the course of this day, its trials, its small mercies, and the watchful eyes upon her, was only beginning to carve a path toward unforeseen revelations. For the first time since her arrival, she sensed that this day, marked by rejection and resilience alike, might not end as bleakly as it had begun. Somewhere beyond the cold stone walls and the frost-laced windows, the Duke's observation lingered like a quiet promise, unspoken yet palpably felt. And as the snow swirled in soft eddies around the stable doors, she inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp, clean air, aware that the fragile thread of possibility had been drawn taut, and that tomorrow, the story of this day, would continue in ways neither of them yet understood. The morning light crept reluctantly through the high stable windows, pale and hesitant, casting long, quivering shadows across the rows of horses and hay-strewn floors. She moved among the animals with quiet precision, brushing a dappled mare until her coat gleamed, her fingers tracing the curve of muscle with the care of one accustomed to tender attention. The scent of fresh hay mingled with the earthy musk of the animals, a comforting contrast to the cold austerity of the manor beyond the stable doors. Each movement she made was deliberate, yet infused with a grace that belied her modest dress and humble station. Even in silence, she spoke of resilience, of courage quietly wrought from necessity, and of a spirit unbowed by the Duke's rigid judgment. From the window above, the Duke watched. His figure was a dark silhouette against the muted light, arms crossed over a coat as black as the winter sky. There was no outward sign of warmth, yet the sharp lines of his jaw softened ever so slightly as his eyes followed her. She did not notice him at first, absorbed in the rhythm of her tasks, but her presence filled the space with a kind of understated dignity that demanded attention. For the first time since his arrival at this manor, he found himself drawn not to the authority of his title, but to the quiet strength of a woman who needed nothing of him, yet moved him profoundly. He stepped forward, his boots muffled against the frozen ground, careful not to disturb the delicate dance she performed among the animals. A scarf lay folded neatly upon the edge of a hay bale, its soft wool glinting faintly in the slanting sunlight. It was a gift, subtle yet deliberate, a token of acknowledgment, a bridge across the rigid walls of propriety that separated them. She picked it up, pressing it to her chest with trembling fingers, warmth spreading not only through her hands, but through a part of her heart she had thought long frozen. The Duke's gesture was unspoken, yet it resonated with a power far greater than words could convey. Recognition, respect, and a first glimmer of admiration. Whispers reached her from the manor, servants curious, gossiping softly behind closed doors, weaving her presence into narratives of intrigue. "He lingers too long near her," one murmured. "Have you seen the way he watches her?" Another whispered, as if the observation itself might incite scandal. She ignored them, as she had learned to do, maintaining her composure and carrying out each task with unwavering focus. The scrutiny of others could not diminish her resolve, nor could it cloud the subtle delight she took in small gestures, the occasional glance from the Duke, the soft curl of acknowledgment in his eyes, the quiet proof that her presence had begun to pierce the ice around his heart. The hours unfolded with a slow, measured grace, broken only by the occasional sound of distant carriages or the soft clatter of hooves in the courtyard. Each brush of her hands across the horses' coats, each adjustment of bedding, each careful piling of fresh hay became a ritual of endurance and quiet artistry. And yet, amid these familiar motions, a new tension wove itself into the air, a sense that the day was no longer simply about survival or propriety, but about connection, about the recognition of life beneath the trappings of title and expectation. A sudden misstep interrupted the rhythm. A lantern, poorly balanced upon a post, tipped over, sending sparks dancing across the hay. The sharp hiss of flame against straw was a jolt, sudden and alarming. She froze, heart hammering, as the smell of smoke began to rise. In an instant he was there, descending the steps with a swiftness that betrayed both concern and authority. Hand steady and deliberate, he snatched the lantern from its precarious perch, extinguishing the threat before it could take hold. Their fingers brushed in that brief, charged moment, and the warmth of his hand lingered far longer than propriety would allow. They exchanged no words, only a glance, a communion of understanding. She looked up at him, meeting the depth of his gaze, and for the first time, he allowed himself to linger on the human being before him rather than the obligations that bound him. In that look lay recognition, an acknowledgment of her courage, and the first trace of an emotional bond neither could yet name aloud. The tension between them shifted imperceptibly, like snow melting into rivulets across frozen stone. The world outside remained rigid, yet within the stable, something delicate and irrevocable was forming. He withdrew slightly, yet did not leave, watching as she regained her composure, her fingers returning to the rhythmic brushing of the mare. She sensed his presence without needing to turn, her pulse quickened, and a quiet awareness of the power she held, not in title, but in endurance and dignity, tugged at her consciousness. Each glance, each gesture, was a negotiation of unspoken terms, respect, acknowledgement, and the cautious emergence of feeling. The dynamic was subtle, nuanced, like a dance performed upon the edge of propriety, and each step carried weight beyond the immediate task at hand. Time stretched further, the afternoon waning into a soft, silvery light as clouds rolled in across the winter sky. Snowflakes swirled outside, turning the courtyard into a silent, shimmering landscape. Yet inside the stable, warmth grew, not from fire, but from attention, from shared space, from the unspoken acknowledgement that the day was shaping them both. Her confidence, previously constrained by fear and circumstance, began to assert itself. She moved with more assurance, a slight curve to her smile, betraying the subtle satisfaction of being seen for more than the sum of her misfortune. A second small incident tightened the bond further. A young filly, startled by the wind rattling the stable doors, leaped, nearly colliding with the bride. Without thinking, he was at her side, steadying the animal and shielding her simultaneously. Their eyes met again, and this time the glance carried a weight of recognition, gratitude, and something tender that neither dared to speak aloud. The moment passed quickly, but its impression lingered, a quiet echo in the chambers of each heart, underscoring the tension between duty and feeling, between social expectation and personal longing. By the time the day began to yield to dusk, the stable was in order, the horses calm, and the air imbued with a soft, domestic warmth. Yet the emotional climate had shifted irreversibly. She understood, with a subtle thrill and a trace of apprehension, that she had begun to unravel the Dukes carefully. Maintain composure. that her mere presence had stirred currents in a heart long hidden behind the walls of propriety. He, for his part, remained a sentinel, steadfast yet undeniably moved, observing her not as an intruder upon his life, but as a quiet force whose existence demanded attention, whose courage and dignity challenged him to consider dimensions of himself he had long neglected. As she paused near the open stable doors, brushing her damp hair from her face, she glimpsed him one final time through the frost-laced windows. There was no proclamation, no overt declaration, only a shadow, poised, attentive, and watchful. And in that silent acknowledgment lay a promise, unspoken yet vivid, that the events of this day were merely the beginning, that the rigid boundaries of propriety had been nudged, and that the connection between them, tentative though it was, would demand reckoning. The snow outside continued to drift, soft and endless, yet within the stable, a quiet revolution had begun, and both of them, in their separate spaces, felt the first stirrings of a change that neither could yet fully name. And as the final light of day slipped behind the Manor's tall towers, a single thought crystallized in her mind. The day had begun with rejection, with propriety and coldness, but it would end with questions, with curiosity, and with the silent acknowledgment that neither she nor the Duke would emerge unchanged from the hours they had shared in the quiet intimacy of the stables. The evening descended slowly upon the manor, draping the stone walls and high windows in a soft, silver-gray twilight. Snow had ceased its relentless fall, leaving the courtyard glazed in a crystalline hush, and inside, the warmth of the hearth filled the great hall with flickering shadows. She moved cautiously along the polished corridors, her skirts whispering against the floorboards, each step measured, yet imbued with the quiet courage that had carried her through the trials of the day. She paused at the doorway to the Duke's study, noticing for the first time the subtle changes that had taken place since her arrival. The faintest loosening of tension in his shoulders, the imperceptible softening of his gaze, and the delicate, almost hesitant way he stood by the fire, awaiting her presence, without command, without judgment. "I did not expect you to join me," he said at last, voice low, carrying both authority and a restrained vulnerability. The crackle of the fire punctuated the silence, shadows dancing across his sharply defined features. She stepped forward, lifting her chin, the light of the fire glinting in her eyes. "I could not remain idle, knowing how much needs tending," she replied softly, the formal words concealing the tremor of hope beneath. She had learned through the hours of snow and toil that strength was not loud or demanding. It was measured, quiet, persistent. He inclined his head, acknowledging her presence, yet he did not speak again immediately. Instead, he gestured toward a chair near the fire, an invitation that was as deliberate as it was tentative. She accepted, sitting with poise, hands folded lightly in her lap, while the warmth of the room seeped into her chilled limbs. For a long moment, neither spoke, and in that silence lay an unspoken communication more profound than any words. Her eyes traveled across the room, noting the shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, the delicate brass fixtures, and the portraits of ancestors whose stern faces seemed to approve of propriety, but not of humanity. It was in this quiet domesticity, with its careful balance of order and comfort, that the real battle of the day had been fought, not of social expectation alone, but of heart and courage. "You have a way of seeing the world differently," he finally said, his voice more intimate than before, yet still careful. "You notice things that others overlook. The horses, the halls, even the silence. It is remarkable." She met his gaze, the firelight capturing the subtle warmth in her eyes. She had never sought recognition, only to survive, yet hearing it from him stirred something fragile, something unspoken, the realization that she was not invisible, that her presence had weight beyond the walls she occupied. A faint smile lifted her lips, small, tentative, yet imbued with a dignity that matched the grace of her movements throughout the day. "I have learned to observe, sir," she said softly. "The world is often more telling in silence than in speech." Her words were measured, yet layered with meaning, for she did not speak merely to answer, but to challenge, to engage, to hold space in a world that had long sought to define her by circumstance rather than character. He took a step closer, the soft leather of his boots muffled against the carpeted floor. "And in your silence, you have taught me something I had long forgotten," he said, each word deliberate, each pause weighted with sincerity. "That propriety, for all its value, cannot govern the heart entirely. That courage, even quiet courage, deserves recognition, and that kindness can exist even where expectation forbids it." She felt the warmth of his presence in a way that had nothing to do with the fire, a presence both protective and admiring, a silent acknowledgement that the day's labors had revealed not only her resilience, but his own capacity for feeling. The fire crackled once, casting golden light across the room, and she found herself leaning slightly forward, compelled by the vulnerability beneath his formality. "I only wish to serve," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of all she had endured. "To meet expectation, even if it meant humility and coldness, I could endure, but I did not wish to impose." Her gaze held his, steady, sincere, unyielding, and in that steady connection lay a truth neither could deny. The quiet bond forged in labor and shared space was as real as any vow, as undeniable as the snow that had fallen relentlessly that day. He reached toward a small table, taking up a cup of tea, then paused, as if weighing propriety against impulse. Finally, he set it down and spoke again, his voice gentler still. "You have imposed only upon my understanding of the world, nothing else. You have challenged my assumptions, awakened my attention, and compelled me to reconsider what it is I desire, not from duty, but from choice." The words fell between them like snow settling upon winter branches, soft, deliberate, and profoundly transformative. She felt a flutter of emotion, a tremor of hope tempered by caution, for such declarations were rare in his world of restraint and expectation. Minutes passed, measured by the slow crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of the wind through the manor chimneys. Each shared glance, each subtle shift of posture, built upon the emotional landscape they had navigated all day, from rejection to acknowledgement, from distance to tentative connection. And then, as if guided by some invisible impulse, he extended his hand toward her, palm upward, a silent offering of trust, of partnership, and of shared vulnerability. She placed her hand in his, the warmth of contact bridging the gap between formality and intimacy. In that simple gesture lay a promise that the day's conflicts, the rigid boundaries and cold refusals, could yield to understanding, compassion, and the first stirrings of love. The room seemed to breathe with them, filled with shadows and light, the scent of the fire mingling with the faint perfume she carried, the soft rustle of her skirts a delicate accompaniment to the quiet thrum of heartbeats. "I cannot imagine this manor without you now," he said, the words deliberate, unhurried, as if each syllable required careful consideration. "If you will allow it, remain, not as a guest, not as a duty, but as someone who belongs by choice, by presence, and by merit." Her chest tightened, a mixture of relief, joy, and the fragile astonishment that comes when one realizes that admiration and acceptance can coexist with dignity. She nodded, words unnecessary, and he lowered his hand to gently fold it around hers. There was no dramatic embrace, no hurried declaration, only a quiet acknowledgement, a measured intimacy that carried all the weight of respect, courage, and dawning affection. The snow outside, undisturbed, glimmered beneath the moonlight, casting the manor in silver and shadow, a silent witness to the quiet revolution that had occurred within its walls. The evening deepened, and with it came a sense of completion, not of an ending, but of transformation. She had entered the manor a stranger, met with cold refusal and whispered judgment, yet she emerged, in the space of a single day, as a presence acknowledged, respected, and quietly cherished. And he, the Duke, once bound by propriety and solitude, had discovered warmth and admiration that neither title nor expectation could suppress. As the final embers of the fire glowed, and the moonlight traced silver patterns across the polished floorboards, they lingered near the hearth, hands still joined, eyes meeting with a depth neither words nor society could define. Outside, the wind was still, the snow unbroken, yet inside the manor, a bond had been forged, delicate, enduring, and irrevocable. The night held them in its quiet embrace, a pause before the days to come, leaving both hearts open, aware that the conflicts of expectation had shifted irrevocably into the territory of understanding, trust, and the first fragile moments of love. And as they stood there, hand in hand, a single thought lingered, as luminous and piercing as the moonlight upon the snow. The day had begun with rejection, with propriety and coldness, yet it would continue in memory and promise, leaving a space where courage, dignity, and quiet affection could bloom, waiting for the morrow to reveal how fully hearts might intertwine.